Welcome to Vineyard Hopkinton. As we follow Jesus together, we experience the Holy Spirit, create a multicultural community, and pursue Kingdom of God justice.
So, we threw random branches or random pieces of tree in the middle of the aisle. Why? Who knows? Who knows what today is? Palm Sunday. Good job, guys. You know. It's 1 week from Easter. It's Palm Sunday. The road is made ready for Jesus to come down, right? So as we jump into this story, let me tell you a different story, okay? If I can. So there's a story that's been passed down for years from the 1890s. If you're younger than 25, the 1890s is not when your parents were alive. That's 100 years before, so... I know, you say that you're born in the 80s now, and teenagers give you a look like it's like what happened? I was at a coffee, this is totally off, but I was at a coffee shop yesterday, and I did look around, and I was like, crap, when did I become the old guy in the room? Like, it was rough, but anyway, it happens to all of us, right, guys? We all get there. But anyway, in the 1890s, there was a boy who lived in the country, who on a farm, and he heard that the circus was coming to town. He had never seen the circus. It's the 1890s. He lives in the middle of nowhere, America, and he was really excited. And so he asked his dad. His dad said that sure he could go. And so Saturday comes when the circus is in town. He gets all his chores done early. He's really pumped. He goes to his dad. It's time. Can I go? His dad reaches in his pocket, takes out a dollar bill and some change, again, 1890s, gives it to him and says, have a great time. It was the most money the boy had ever had. He was ecstatic, and he starts walking towards town. As he's walking towards town, he sees people are starting to line the streets, and he's like, what's going on? And so people are getting thick the further in that he goes, and he's like, I got to see what it is that's happening. So in true little boy fashion, he gets on his hands and his knees, he crawls through, goes awkwardly under people's legs, shoots up at the edge to watch what was coming down the street. And it was the circus parade. And so he's sitting there just enthralled by the huge trailers painted with all sorts of things and the animals that he's never seen before. And then there's people doing tricks, juggling and whatnot in the middle of the street. There's clowns, of course, and he's just so excited by what it is that he's seeing. So he just watches and watches and watches until the parade begins to come to an end. And he sees the last clown, and he realizes, shoot, my dad gave me money so I could get in to be able to see this. So he reaches into his pocket, takes out that dollar bill, and runs out to the street and hands it to the clown as he walks on by. People start dispersing, and the boy walks home. That night, he's sitting at dinner with his dad, and he's so happy. And so he's telling his dad all about the circus that he just saw. And he's telling him about the clowns and the painted trailers and the lions and tigers and bears and whatever else they had. And the people juggling in the middle of the street and all the interesting stuff that he loved. And his dad at one point just pauses and he looks at him and he says, well, what about the tents and the magicians and the people swinging, high above on the trapeze? And the son's just so excited he doesn't even kind of connect what it is that his dad's asking him. And he's like, oh, they didn't have that. And just keeps going on. It was at that point that the dad realized that he had mistaken the parade for the circus. I think sometimes, and in some ways, people have done that with Jesus on Palm Sunday. They mistake the parade from the main event because the parade was a pretty darn good party, right? Jesus on a donkey, who doesn't want that? If I entered on a donkey, you guys would be excited about that, right? Next year, not happening, not doing it. There's people singing, they're throwing coats, they're throwing palm branches on the ground, like people lined up for miles. It's amazing. It's, the type of thing that you want to be a part of. And it's really easy to mistake what was going on Palm Sunday for the main event. But that's not the main event. The main event's what's coming next. And the folks who were at the parade were shocked and amazed by what Jesus did after that point. It's not that Jesus didn't tell them. It's that I think like everybody at the parade is kind of like our teenage daughters when it comes to listening. They're looking at you, but it's not going through. I think they miss it a little bit. Or maybe they just misread it. But this morning, as we look towards the cross, we begin to point ourselves towards Easter. And as we look at this parade, I don't want us to miss what it is that Jesus is telling us as he actually talks in this story, not just the crowd. And so we're going to watch what it is that he has to say in this. If you have a Bible and you want to open up, it's in Luke 19 that I'm going to read it from this morning, verses 28 through 40, or you can read with me on the screens. It says, after telling this story, Jesus went on towards Jerusalem, walking ahead of the disciples. And as he came to the towns of Bethphage and Bethany on the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 disciples ahead. Go into that village over there, he told them. And as you enter it, you will see a young donkey tied there that no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks, why are you untying that colt? Just say, the Lord needs it. So they went and they found the colt just as Jesus had said. And sure enough, as they were untying it, that's the best phrase in this entire story. Sure enough, yes, if you steal somebody's animal, they're going to ask you what you're doing. But sure enough, they said, why are you untying that colt? And the disciples just simply replied, the Lord needs it. And so they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their garments over it for him to ride on. And as he rode along, the crowd spread out their garments on the road ahead of him. When he reached the place where the road started down the Mount of Olives, all of his followers began to shout and sing as they walked along, praising God for the wonderful miracles that they had seen. Blessings on the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven. But some of the Pharisees said, Teacher, rebuke your followers for saying things like that. And Jesus replied, if they kept quiet, the stones along the road would burst into cheers. It's super exciting, right? It was literally an entrance fit for a king. That's what they get hot and bothered about. This is the way that you bring in a king into Jerusalem. And yet, even though he was a king, the throne that Jesus is leading them to is not what they expected. The path that he's getting ready to take them on is not where they thought they were going to go. And this morning, instead of the parade, I want to focus on these 2 things that Jesus says on either side of what it is that the crowd is up to. The words before and after the donkey ride that he takes. Verse 31 says, if anyone asks, why are you untying the colt? Just say, the Lord needs it. Can you imagine what the owners of that donkey must have thought? I mean, really. Like, this is such a weird story. Like, 2 guys randomly show up, and they just start untying it, and then they take your stuff. It's a pretty shocking thing. Because of how strange it is that Jesus would tell his followers to go steal an animal, because it's Jesus and you don't want to say that Jesus is saying to go steal an animal. There's actually theologians that have hypothesized that Jesus knew which house they were going to go to, and that this was his secret code that he had created with them ahead of time, which I find to be hilarious. That is some deep dive reading of this passage. Super fun, right? But really hard to ever confirm that he had a secret code with somebody. Most likely, they had no relationship with Jesus, and yet somehow they were willing, when the disciples said this, to respond by actually giving up their donkey. Just two guys that show up and say, the master needs your stuff. How would you deal with that? Somebody showed up at your house and said, hey, the master needs the keys to your house for the weekend. Master needs your car. What would you respond in those moments? I wonder if you've ever had Jesus say that he needs something of yours. This phrase, the master needs it, grabbed a hold of me as I was reading it this time because it's repeated twice, and it's such a unique phrase. You don't come across a lot of times where we're told that Jesus needs something. I mean, Jesus is the dude who takes a little kid's lunch and feeds 20,000 people. Jesus is the person who goes and sees somebody who's been blind, lame, sick for decades, prays for them, and heals them. Jesus is the guy who sees a funeral parade going by and says, wait a second, stop guys, goes, prays for the person who just died, and they come back to life. Like, for Jesus to say that he needs something of you is kind of unique. And in the Greek, the word for needs, it's a two-word phrase, and it's ekokoria. And this phrase is used throughout the New Testament, but it's used in a way that always implies that action is needed from us. So when we're looking at this story of what Jesus needs, the most obvious thing that he needs from us in this story is something that's necessary to his mission, right? To his immediate mission. Jesus needed somebody to go get the donkey. Any volunteers? You know, there's obedience, and then there's what I would call sent obedience. Obedience is saying, yes, I'll go do it. Sent obedience is saying, okay, I'm going to leave right now and go to the place and walk it out and actually do it, right? It's got two steps, go and obey. Are you willing to get a donkey for Jesus? Are you willing to be sent and to obey what it is that he's asking of you? I was thinking about this, and I was reminded of an earlier encounter that I had with one of our neighbors, and he actually just passed away recently. We've lived in our house for like 5.5, 6 years, and our neighbor's he was sick like the entire time. He was never in good health when we lived there. And so we didn't have a lot of encounters over the years. But one of the first ones that we ever had was around Christmas time, the first year that we were there. I think I'd met him once before that. And he saw me out with the girls and came and asked me to help him with setting up some Christmas lights in his house. So I've never been in his house. I barely have had a conversation with him by this point. But I'm like, okay, here we go. So I go into his house, and as I walk in, I saw these amazing vintage, big, multicolored Christmas bulbs. You guys know what I'm talking about, like they had in the 1890s. No. But you know what I'm talking about, the old ones. The problem was that, as with many old wires of Christmas lights, the wires were a little bit frayed, a little exposed. And so he had set it up on a coat stand with coats on it. So fabric and exposed wires plugged into the wall. And I looked at that and I was like, oh, shoot. Let's try and help him to not burn the house down before Christmas this year. So we rearranged things and made it a little less dangerous. And then I said goodnight and left. And as I walked out, I was like, I just felt this kind of nudge to go buy him a Christmas tree. So I went home, I grabbed the girls, I said, we're going Christmas tree shopping. So we immediately went out, grabbed a Christmas tree with the lights already on it and all that, came back to his house, and Micaiah and I set it up in his house for him. Gave him an actual tree instead of a deadly coat hanger tree, which was well-intentioned, but did freak me out a little bit. I was like, this is not going to go well. You know, I didn't hear Jesus audibly say that I needed to go do that. But I knew there was a nudge to go show love to somebody who probably wasn't feeling a lot of love from other people. Sometimes Jesus just needs us to go get the donkey. No questions, no extras. Just go get the donkey and then walk it out and see what it is that he wants to do next. Sent obedience. The most common need, though, of Jesus that we see referenced in the New Testament is when Jesus tells us that he needs us to do stuff for other people, right? Acts chapter 2, verse 45 says, they sold their property and possessions and shared their money with those in need. Acts 4:35, and bring the money to the apostles to give to those in need. There's a lot of these throughout the New Testament, and I would call it generous obedience. It's saying yes with a full knowledge that it might cost you. How do you feel about those requests? Sure, Jesus, take my donkey, even if I don't get it back. You know, Sarah has been a great instigator of generous obedience for me since we got married. And one of the main ways is she loves to loan out her car especially when we're traveling to people. And this has been great. We've had lots of good experiences letting people borrow it that are down a vehicle, that are in between, stuff like that. That's been great. It's gone pretty well. But loaning your car could be an expensive thing, right? Anybody feel a twinge around that when you're like, what if they hit something or somebody, or what if something happens? And we haven't had that since we've been married. But before we were married, there were a couple of stories that I heard that have made me process through how willing I am to do this. There was one time that Sarah let her roommate borrow her car. And Sarah likes to drive stick shift vehicles. And the roommate said that she knew how to drive it. So she goes out and she's out there for a few minutes. And then suddenly there's this explosion-like sound that comes from outside of the house. And they run outside to see it. And they see her car and the neighbor's porch meeting in the middle loudly. There was another time in seminary that a classmate borrowed her car and promptly drove it into a neighbor's car. So, sometimes a willingness to say yes comes with a full knowledge that it might actually cost you something. But I think what we're being taught here is, why do we say yes to that? Because Jesus asks it of us. Because he said he needs it. And so we're willing to say yes. Obedience, whether it's sent or generous, it happens because he asks and we respond. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells about this. He says, "For I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you invited me into your home. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you cared for me. I was in prison and you visited me." Then these righteous ones will reply, "Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will say, "I tell you the truth, when you did it for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me." He says it much more plainly in John 14:15. "If you love me, keep my commands." Simple obedience leads us on the path of Jesus, leads us on the Palm Sunday path, if we learn to say yes. But that's not the only thing that he said, right? At the very end of this story, he says something that's kind of weird and strange and out there. He talks about rocks talking. And people officially wondered if he had lost it, right? The clergy come up to him, and they're angry, and they say, "Tell your people that they need to stop talking." And he says, "Fine, but if they stop talking, then the rocks are going to start talking, because somebody's got to shout out right now." What is that? The crazy thing is that to both Jesus and the Pharisees, the people he was talking to, they all actually knew what this meant when Jesus said it. If somebody said something like that to you, would you have a clue what it is that was being referenced? Maybe not. So what can stones cheering teach us? I want to run through 4 things really quickly. The first is that it's possible for us to be blind to the movement of God. Theologian Justo Gonzalez says that Jesus' answer highlights what false peace truly costs us: the ability to see the work of God in our midst. False peace costs us the ability to see the work of God in our midst. What he's pointing at is that what the religious leaders were upset about was that they didn't want to ruffle the feathers of the Roman political leaders of their time. And the things that the crowd was saying were going to upset the Roman political leaders. And they had this probably not very healthy religiously balance going on between them, where everybody could stay in power and nobody said anything to offend the other. And so they were walking that tightrope down between them. And then suddenly a miles-long crowd starts to shout out these phrases about a king coming into Jerusalem. This is the main reason that they crucified Jesus. The main reason they were able to get the whole crowd to go along with them to crucify him is because of what they were saying right here, that they were saying Jesus is king. And Jesus' response to their shouts of kingship was not to hush them up, not to say stop talking, but it was to say it's true, whether or not people say it or not. Because if the people don't say it, who's going to? The stones. Friends, we got to be careful that we don't put blinders on the work and the presence of Jesus, that we don't close our eyes to what's going on in front of us just because it's uncomfortable. The second thing that it teaches us is that whether we recognize it or not, Jesus is king. Jesus sees the irony that's lived out here. And this is how he answers to these clergy that come to him. He says, don't you guys think it's hilarious? You're alive, and yet you don't get it. But if all these other alive people stop talking, the inanimate objects, the non-living beings would start talking in their place. That's what he says here. He says that even if all the people in Jerusalem don't realize who Jesus is, the stones do. It's fact, not popular opinion. Maybe you need to hear that one more time. Jesus is king. It's fact, not popular opinion. The third thing that the rocks crying out teaches us is that Jesus' entrance was good news for those dealing with injustice and violence. So what you may not recognize that Jesus and the Pharisees would have is that the only other time in the Bible that they talk about rocks crying out is in Habakkuk. We've been in Habakkuk and Zephaniah throughout Lent. And in Habakkuk 2, 9 through 14 is where it talks about this. It says, "What sorrow awaits you who build big houses with money gained dishonestly. You believe your wealth will buy security, putting your family's nest beyond the reach of danger. But by the murders you've committed, you've shamed your name and forfeited your lives. The very stones and the walls cry out against you, and the beams and the ceilings echo the complaint. What sorrow awaits you who build cities with money gained through murder and corruption. Has not the Lord of heaven's armies promised that the wealth of nations will turn to ashes? They work so hard, but all in vain. For as the waters fill the sea, the earth will be filled with an awareness of the glory of the Lord." Now, obviously, this is different than what the context that Jesus was saying it in Luke. But Jesus is connecting these two because it's the only time it's ever mentioned in the Bible. So if we break it down in Habakkuk 1, verse 2, it says that Habakkuk is crying out to God about the injustice and the violence that he was seeing. And the word for cry out in Hebrew is za'ak. And here in chapter 2, he says that the stones are crying out against the violence and injustice. So in chapter 1, a human's crying out. In chapter 2, even the humans aren't crying out because they don't want to condemn themselves. And so the stones have to cry out in their place. In this instance, what's happening that Habakkuk's doing when he talks about stones and wooden beams crying out is that he's making them living witnesses to the violence and injustice that's being done by Israel. If you read the books of the law, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, some of your favorite parts of the Bible probably, they say in it very clearly that in order to judge something and someone about injustice, that it requires 2 witnesses. And so Habakkuk says, here's 2, stones and wooden beams. You didn't cry out against it, so they have to. Somebody's got to speak for the people who are being unjustly dealt with. They're called witnesses to the judgment of God here. So Jesus would have known all of this as a rabbi, and the Pharisees would have too. The stones crying out implied a need to call out to the violence that was being done around them. But stones are only used if, as witnesses, if who doesn't speak up? Us. So if we don't speak up, I guess even this P16 is going to have to cry out. No. But if we don't speak up, somebody has to. Are we willing to speak up and to be the voice? If these people are silent, then the stones would need to start shouting. That's what Jesus was getting at. But friends, there's another part of this that we see pretty readily, right? And this is the last thing, that when we see Jesus, it always brings joy, even from inanimate objects. When Jesus reached the place where the road started down, all of his followers began to shout and sing as they walked along, praising God for all the miracles that they had seen. Blessings on the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven, glory in the highest heaven. Some of the Pharisees said, "Teacher, rebuke your followers for saying things like that." And he replied, well, if they kept quiet, even the stones along the road would burst into cheers. Have you ever had somebody cry out in joy when they've seen you? If you have kids, grandkids around, you probably have. You may have heard a favorite family story of when one of our nephews, he was, I'll just humbly say he was obsessed with me when he was little. He was a little bit. He was very attached. And there was one time we were at their house, and he was following me around everywhere, like legit everywhere. And I went to the bathroom. So I had to push him out. And so he did what little kids do. He awkwardly inserted himself in the only way that he could. He got on the ground and he looked under the crack in the door. And it was kind of an older door, so the crack's a little bit bigger than it should have been. And so he could see my feet. And so he shouts out, he's like, Mommy, I see T.O. Stevens' shoes. And then he yells, he's like, T.O. Steven, hi. Just really excited to be able to see my shoes when I was going to the bathroom. There's something amazing that happens when we allow ourselves to find joy at seeing somebody, right? And that's what's going on with all these people when they see Jesus coming down the road. They couldn't keep it in. They had to speak up. They had to say something because it was such good news that he was there. Their joy was just beginning. It was going to go through a crucible of pain and grief and suffering in the next coming days that they had no idea about. But true joy was on its way. Friends, as we get ready to worship, I just want to say that there is joy in knowing Jesus. And I want to give us an opportunity before we worship to just in our hearts allow ourselves to pause and to say, am I finding joy in the presence of Jesus this morning?